At 5:43 on the morning of June 9th, 1942, Junior Lieutenant Lyudmila Pavlichenko lay motionless in a pile of limestone rubble on the outskirts of Sevastopol. She was watching a patch of scrub brush 300 meters away through a scope that her recruiting officer had told her she would never be smart enough to use. 25 years old, history student at Kiev University. 309 confirmed kills pending. The Germans had a counter-sniper team operating in this sector. In the past 48 hours, they had killed 3 Soviet machine gunners and a spotter from Lyudmila's own platoon. Her commanding officer had called her Lady Death in the newspapers, but back in Odessa, the recruitment sergeant had called her something else. He called her a model with a death wish. When she had walked into the recruitment office in June 1941, wearing a silk dress and heels, the sergeant wanted to know if she was looking for a husband or a hospital ward. Lyudmila explained she was there for the infantry. The Germans were crossing the border. The sergeant laughed. He looked at her nails. They were manicured. He looked at her hair. It was styled. He told her the infantry was for men who could dig trenches and sleep in the mud. He told her to go be a nurse. He said the Red Army didn't need history students. They needed bodies that could carry ammo crates. Lyudmila didn't leave. She reached into her purse and pulled out a Voroshilov sharpshooter badge and a marksman certificate from a paramilitary training club. She slammed them on the desk. The sergeant stopped laughing, but he didn't give her a rifle. Not yet. He sent her to the 25th Rifle Division with no weapon, no uniform, and no boots. Lyudmila spent the voyage to the front lines, watching other men clean their Mosin Nagants, while she sat empty-handed. She requested a rifle. The supply officer told her there weren't enough. He handed her a shovel. She dug trenches. She carried ammunition. She waited. The standard issue Mosin Nagant, 1891/30, weighed 8.8 pounds. The 3.5 times PU scope added another pound. The German Moser car, 98 kiwi across the lines, weighed 8.6 pounds. It had better machining, smoother bolt action, and superior Zeiss optics. Lyudmila didn't care about the machining. She knew the ballistics. The Soviet 7.62 by 54 mm R cartridge carried 2,600 foot-pounds of energy. It hit harder than the German 8 mm. It flew flatter at long range. But first, she had to get one. Her chance came during a defensive withdrawal near Belyaevka. A soldier next to her took a piece of shrapnel to the throat. He dropped his rifle. Lyudmila picked it up. It was a standard infantry rifle, iron sights, no scope. The bolt was stiff with grit. The platoon commander saw her holding it. He ordered her to drop it and get back to digging. Lyudmila refused. She told him she knew how to shoot. The commander pointed to a ridgeline 400 meters across the river. 2 Romanian soldiers were moving along the trenchworks, setting up a machine gun. "Prove it," he said. He expected her to miss. He expected the recoil to knock the model onto her back. Lyudmila settled into the dirt. She didn't have a spotter. She didn't have a wind gauge. She adjusted the rear sight leaf to 400. She checked the grass moving in the wind, left to right, maybe 5 miles per hour. She held the front post slightly to the left of the lead soldier. She squeezed the trigger. The Mosin kicked into her shoulder. The sound cracked through the valley. The first Romanian soldier dropped. The second soldier froze, looking for the source of the shot. Lyudmila worked the bolt. The empty steel cartridge ejected. She chambered another round. She fired again. The second soldier fell backward into the trench. 2 shots, 2 kills, iron sights, 400 meters. The commander wasn't laughing anymore. He ordered the supply sergeant to issue her a camouflage suit and a scoped rifle immediately. If you want to see how a history student became the most feared woman in World War II, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this. And please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Lyudmila. She had her rifle now, a Mosin Nagant with a PE scope, 4-power magnification. She spent the night cleaning it. She stripped the bolt. She oiled the firing pin. She checked the scope mount screws. They were loose. Factory defect. She tightened them with the edge of a coin until her fingers bled. The next morning, the 25th Rifle Division was ordered to hold the perimeter around Odessa. The Germans were throwing 18 divisions against them. Artillery, tanks, Stuka, dive bombers. Lyudmila moved into position in a grove of burnt oak trees. She didn't dig a foxhole. Foxholes were coffins if the mortars started falling. She crawled into the hollow of a dead tree and began to watch the fields through her scope. The PE scope had a narrow field of view. You had to scan slowly. The battlefield was never silent. Explosions, engines, screaming. Lyudmila learned to filter out the noise. She focused on patterns. At 8:15, she saw it, a helmet rising above the grass. German gray. She watched. The helmet moved. A head appeared, an officer shouting orders to his men. He was waving a pistol. He felt safe. He was 600 meters away, too far for a submachine gun, too far for a standard rifleman. But not for Lyudmila. She adjusted her elevation drum. 600 meters. She controlled her breathing. Inhale, exhale, pause. She was just a girl from Bila Tserkva who liked history books. Now she was about to find out if she could kill a man who was looking right at her. Lyudmila squeezed the trigger. The Mosin Nagant bucked against her shoulder, driving the woodstock into her collarbone. The sound of the shot was lost in the distant rumble of artillery, but 600 meters away, the result was silent and absolute. The German officer didn't hear the report. The bullet was traveling faster than sound. He simply collapsed. The pistol flew from his hand. He hit the dry Ukrainian dirt before his men even realized he was dead. Lyudmila didn't celebrate. She didn't gasp. She worked the bolt. The heavy steel handle required force. She slapped it up, pulled it back, slammed it forward. The empty brass casing spun into the dead leaves at the bottom of the hollow tree. She chambered another round and put her eye back to the scope. The German soldiers were scrambling. They didn't know where the shot had come from. They were looking at the tree line, looking at the ridge, looking everywhere except the burnt tree stump in the middle of the field. Lyudmila settled the crosshairs on a machine gunner who was trying to set up his MG-34. She accounted for the wind, still drifting left. She aimed for the center of his chest. Crack. The machine gunner fell backward over his weapon. Now they knew. Sniper. The Germans hit the dirt. Mortar teams began shouting coordinates. Lyudmila knew the doctrine: shoot and relocate. If you stay in one spot for more than 2 shots, you die. She grabbed her rifle and slid backward out of the tree hollow. She crawled on her stomach through the tall grass, dragging the 9-pound rifle through the dirt. She moved 50 yards south, to a drainage ditch she had scouted 3 hours earlier. She pressed herself into the mud and waited. 2 minutes later, 3 mortar rounds obliterated the hollow tree she had just occupied. Splinters of burnt oak rained down on the field. If she had stayed to admire her handiwork, she would be a memory. This was the first lesson of the siege of Odessa. The sniper who seeks glory dies. The sniper who seeks invisibility survives. For the next 10 weeks, Lyudmila Pavlichenko went to work. She treated the battlefield like a calculus problem. The variables were wind, distance, temperature, and human psychology. The temperature in August hit 90 degrees. The heat shimmer rising off the ground made targets beyond 500 meters dance and blur in the scope. Lyudmila learned to shoot in the mornings and evenings when the air was stable. She learned that German helmets reflected sunlight. She learned that cigarette smoke was visible from 800 meters. She learned that if you shot a soldier in the leg, he would scream. His friends would come to help him. Then you could shoot the friends. It was brutal. It was cold. It was necessary. The men in her unit stopped talking about her manicure. They stopped joking about her silk dress. When she walked back to the perimeter wire at dusk, covered in dust and gun oil, the infantrymen stepped aside. They looked at her rifle. The wood was scratched. The finish was wearing off the bolt handle from constant use. By mid-September, her tally stood at 100 confirmed kills. She was killing more efficiently than the cholera that was sweeping through the trenches. But the Germans were adapting. They knew a Russian witch was operating in the sector. They stopped walking in the open. They stopped wearing officer insignia. And they sent their own hunters. On September 29th, a German bullet struck the sandbag 6 inches from Lyudmila's face. The impact sprayed silica dust into her eyes. She froze. The shot had come from the northwest, from a cluster of industrial ruins. A counter-sniper. He was good. He had waited for the sun to be behind him, so the glare would be in Lyudmila's eyes. She didn't panic. She didn't move. She knew he was waiting for her to flinch, to raise her head, to look for him. She lay in the dirt for 4 hours. She urinated in her trousers rather than move. She let the flies crawl on her face rather than swat them. Patience was the weapon. The rifle was just the tool. The German sniper got bored, or maybe he got confident. At 1640, the sun angle changed. Shadows lengthened. Lyudmila saw movement in a pile of rusted girders 400 meters away. The German was shifting his weight. He was uncomfortable. He raised his head slightly to scan the perimeter. Lyudmila had been watching that exact spot for 240 minutes. She didn't need to calculate range. She had ranged it mentally hours ago. She squeezed the trigger. The German sniper's helmet spun off his head. He slumped forward, his rifle clattering down the concrete slab. Kill number 127. But the war was not going well. The 25th Rifle Division was being bled white. The Germans had encircled Odessa. On October 15th, the order came to evacuate. The city was falling. Lyudmila stood on the deck of a transport ship as it pulled away from the burning harbor. She had arrived in Odessa as a student with a shovel. She was leaving as a sergeant with 187 kills. She watched the smoke rise over the city she had failed to save. She gripped the railing until her knuckles turned white. She thought the worst was over. She thought nothing could be harder than the heat and the hunger of Odessa. She was wrong. The ship was heading for Sevastopol, the Crimean Peninsula. The Germans called it the Fortress. The Soviets called it the Meat Grinder. In Sevastopol, the terrain wasn't flat fields and industrial ruins. It was mountains, caves, and white limestone rock that offered no cover and blinded you in the sun. And in Sevastopol, the Germans weren't just sending infantry. They were bringing the 11th Army. They were bringing the best snipers in the Wehrmacht. Lyudmila checked her rifle. The action was clean. The scope was zeroed. She had 120 rounds of ammunition in her pack. She was about to need every single one of them. The siege of Sevastopol began in November 1941. If Odessa was a furnace, Sevastopol was a meat grinder built of white limestone. The terrain was a sniper's nightmare. No trees, no grass. Just jagged chalk cliffs and rocky ravines that reflected the sun until your eyes burned. Lyudmila Pavlichenko stepped off the transport into this white hell. She was no longer the rookie with a shovel. She was a junior lieutenant with 187 kills. But in Sevastopol, the game changed. You couldn't hide in a tree hollow. There were no trees. You had to become the rock. Lyudmila traded her green camouflage for white and gray rags. She learned to dust her rifle wraps with chalk. She learned to lay motionless on hard stone for 15 hours at a time. The cold was sharper here. The wind coming off the Black Sea cut through the standard-issue wool coats. But she wasn't shivering alone. Command paired her with a spotter, Senior Lieutenant Leonid Kitsenko. He was older, experienced, and grim. He had seen the war before Lyudmila was born. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. In the world of high-stakes sniping, conversation gets you killed. A shooter and a spotter communicate with hand signals and rhythm. Leonid carried a submachine gun and binoculars. Lyudmila carried the Mosin Nagant. They became a single organism. Leonid found the targets. Lyudmila ended them. On December 22nd, they set up an ambush on a mountain road near the Kamishli ravine. A German convoy was moving supplies to the front. 3 trucks, 40 men. Leonid ranged the lead truck, 700 meters. Wind left to right, 2 clicks, he whispered. Lyudmila dialed the scope. She aimed for the engine block of the first truck. Crack! The armor-piercing round shattered the engine manifold. The truck slewed sideways, blocking the narrow mountain pass. The convoy halted. German soldiers spilled out of the trucks, shouting, looking for cover. They hid behind the wheels. They hid in the ditch. It didn't matter. Lyudmila and Leonid were positioned 300 feet above them on a cliff face. Lyudmila fired. A soldier exposed his legs. She put a round through his knee. He screamed. 2 men ran to drag him to safety. Lyudmila shot them both. This wasn't hunting anymore. This was attrition. This was breaking the enemy's will to fight. For 3 months, Lyudmila and Leonid terrorized the 11th Army. They would leave the perimeter before dawn, crawl through the minefields, and disappear into the rocks. They would return after dark, frozen, starving, but alive. And somewhere in the cold and the killing, the professional distance broke. They fell in love. It was inevitable. 2 people relying on each other for survival in a world of death. They applied for a marriage license. They planned a future for when the war ended. But the war doesn't care about your plans. On March 4th, 1942, they were moving into a counter-sniper position near the Belbek Valley. The Germans had saturated the area with mortar teams. They heard the whistle first, that terrifying rising shriek of incoming ordnance. "Down!" Leonid shouted. He threw his body over Lyudmila, just as the 81mm mortar shell impacted 3 meters away. The explosion tore the limestone apart. When the dust settled, Lyudmila was deafened, covered in white chalk and blood. She pushed herself up. She was alive. Leonid was not. The shrapnel had taken his arm. It had taken his life. Lyudmila didn't scream. She didn't leave him. She grabbed his body. He was a big man, heavy with dead weight. She was 5 feet 5 inches. She dragged him through the rocks. She dragged him through the scrub brush. She dragged him 2 miles back to the Soviet lines, while German machine guns raked the hillside. She delivered his body to the medics. She refused to go to the hospital. She went back to her bunker. She cleaned her rifle. She loaded 5 fresh rounds. Something changed in Lyudmila that day. Before, she was a soldier doing a job. She was calculating wind and distance. Now, she was hunting with hate. The Germans sensed it. Her daily kill count rose. 220, 240, 250. She stopped taking breaks. She stopped eating. She lived through the scope. The Germans knew who she was. They brought up loudspeakers to the front lines. They stopped broadcasting propaganda about communism. They started broadcasting to her. "Lyudmila!" the voice boomed across the valley. "Come over to us. We will give you plenty of chocolate and make you a German officer." Lyudmila lay in her hide, listening to the voice. Chocolate? They were offering her chocolate while Leonid's blood was still dried on her uniform. She adjusted her elevation. She aimed at the loudspeaker horn. Crack! The voice died in a screech of feedback. "Lyudmila!" The voice returned on a backup speaker, angry now. "If we catch you, we will tear you into 309 pieces." They knew her number. 309. They were keeping count too, but they had made a mistake. They threatened her. Lyudmila didn't fear death. She had already seen it. She had dragged it 2 miles through the limestone. Now, she was going to introduce them to it. By May 1942, Lyudmila Pavlichenko was no longer just a soldier. She was a ghost story, whispered in German trenches. The 11th Army had tried mortars. They had tried artillery. They had tried machine gun sweeps. Lyudmila was still there. 300 confirmed kills. The German High Command decided that to kill a master, you don't send an army, you send a better master. They flew in a specialist from Berlin, a sniper with over 400 kills, a veteran of Dunkirk in France, an instructor who taught other men how to kill from the shadows. He wasn't a conscript, he was an artist of death. He didn't come to Sevastopol to take ground. He came to take a trophy. He came for Lady Death. The duel began on a Tuesday morning in the sector near the Inkerman Heights. The terrain was a graveyard of broken limestone and twisted rebar, a no-man's land where nothing moved and lived. Lyudmila knew he was there before she saw him. 2 Soviet snipers had been killed in this sector in the last 24 hours. Both shot through the eye. Both shot just as the sun was rising. This was a message. The German was clearing the board. He was inviting her to play. Lyudmila accepted the invitation. She moved into position at 3 o'clock, 3 hours before dawn. She chose a position low to the ground, dug into a pile of crushed concrete. She didn't take the high ground. High ground silhouettes you against the sky. The low ground makes you part of the dirt. She settled in. She waited. Dawn broke. The sun hit the white rocks. The glare was blinding. Lyudmila scanned the German lines. The 4-power PE scope on her Mosin Nagant was good, but it wasn't perfect. The German ace was using a Zeiss 6-power scope. He had the optical advantage. He could see the buttons on her tunic from 800 yards. Day 1 passed in silence. Neither shooter moved. Neither shooter fired. It was a contest of bladders and discipline. If you moved to scratch an itch, you died. If you shifted to relieve a cramp, you died. The sun beat down. The rocks radiated heat like an oven. Lyudmila's mouth was dry as dust, but she didn't drink. Reaching for a canteen creates movement. Night fell. Lyudmila withdrew, crawling backwards inch by inch until she was safe. She slept for 4 hours. She cleaned her rifle. She went back. Day 2. The German was getting aggressive. He fired a shot at a Soviet helmet propped up on a stick, a decoy Lyudmila's unit had set up. He put a bullet right through the center. He knew it was a decoy. He was taunting her. He was saying, "I am here. I am watching. Come out." Lyudmila didn't take the bait. She marked the muzzle flash, a cluster of rocks 600 meters away. Now she knew the neighborhood, but she didn't know the house. Day 3. The tension was physically painful. Lyudmila's muscles were locked in spasms. Her eyes were stinging from the strain of staring through the glass. The German sniper was good. He had stayed in the same general area for 72 hours. He was confident. But confidence is a sniper's worst enemy. At 11 a.m., the sun moved overhead. The shadows shifted. The German made a mistake. It wasn't a big mistake. He didn't stand up. He didn't wave. He just assumed that Lyudmila was gone. He thought he had won the waiting game. He shifted his position to get a better angle on the Soviet trench line. He raised his head maybe 3 inches above his cover. Through the scope, Lyudmila saw the movement, a patch of gray against the white rock. She saw the glint of his optics. She didn't hesitate. She didn't think about his 400 kills. She didn't think about his training. She thought about the wind. 0 value. She thought about the range. 600 meters. She exhaled. She squeezed the trigger. The Mosin Nagant roared. The bullet crossed the 600 meters in less than a second. It struck the German sniper in the bridge of the nose. He dropped instantly. The duel was over. Lyudmila waited 30 minutes. Then she did something reckless. She crawled out into no man's land. She had to know. She crawled to the German position, dodging machine gun fire. She found the body. She went through his pockets. She found his logbook. She opened it. The entries were meticulous. France, Poland, Russia. Over 400 confirmed kills recorded in neat handwriting. He was the best the Wehrmacht had, and he lay dead in the dirt, killed by the girl with the manicure. Lyudmila took the logbook. She took his rifle. She crawled back to her lines. When she showed the logbook to her commander, the news spread like wildfire. The German ace was dead. The kill count stood at 309. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was the apex predator of the Eastern Front. But the war has a way of balancing the scales. You can be the best shooter in the world, but you can't shoot a mortar shell out of the air. In June 1942, just weeks after the duel, the Luftwaffe began a massive bombardment of the Soviet positions. They weren't looking for a sniper anymore. They were leveling the mountain. A mortar shell landed near Lyudmila's bunker. The shrapnel tore into her face and back. She was carried out on a stretcher, bleeding, unconscious. The Lady Death of Sevastopol was down. The Germans cheered. They thought they had finally killed her. They were wrong. They had just made her a legend. Lyudmila Pavlichenko woke up on a stretcher. The smell wasn't ozone and limestone anymore. It was diesel fuel and recycled air. She tried to sit up. A hand pushed her back down. She was in the belly of a Soviet submarine, slipping out of Sevastopol harbor beneath a German naval blockade. The High Command had made a calculation. The 25th Rifle Division was doomed. The city was falling. There were 100,000 Soviet soldiers trapped on the peninsula with their backs to the sea. They couldn't save everyone, so they saved the symbols. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, Lady Death, the hero of the Soviet Union, the woman with 309 kills, could not be captured. If the Germans took her alive, they wouldn't just kill her. They would parade her in a cage. They would break her on camera to break Soviet morale. So she was ordered onto the submarine. As the vessel dove and turned east toward the mainland, Lyudmila lay in the dark, listening to the hull creak. She wasn't thinking about her survival. She was thinking about the men she left on the docks. She was thinking about the spotters, the riflemen, the friends who were currently fighting with rocks and bayonets because the ammunition had run dry. When Sevastopol finally fell in July 1942, the Germans captured 95,000 Soviet prisoners. Most would starve to death in camps. Lyudmila had survived the bullet, the mortar shell, and the evacuation. But the survivor's guilt was heavier than the shrapnel still embedded in her back. She spent a month in a hospital in the Caucasus. The doctors dug the metal out of her spine. They stitched her face. She told them to hurry up. She wanted a rifle. She wanted to go back to the front. But the Red Army had a different mission for her. She was summoned to Moscow. The order didn't come from a battalion commander. It came from the top. They didn't hand her a Mosin Nagant. They handed her a plane ticket. Destination, the United States of America. The Allies were stalling. The Soviet Union was fighting the bulk of the Nazi war machine alone in the East. Stalin needed the Americans and the British to open a second front in Europe to relieve the pressure. He needed someone to go to Washington and look the Americans in the eye. Someone who had seen the blood. Someone who couldn't be ignored. He sent the girl with the scar on her face and 309 kills on her record. Lyudmila didn't speak English. She didn't know diplomatic protocol. She didn't own a dress. She packed her uniform, the olive drab tunic with the collar tabs of a senior lieutenant, the heavy black boots, the Voroshilov sharpshooter badge, and the gold star of the hero of the Soviet Union. She flew across the ocean, leaving the mud of Russia for the marble of Washington, D.C. The culture shock hit her like a physical blow. In Russia, women were flying combat planes and commanding tank platoons. In 1942, America, women were expected to wear skirts, cook dinner, and keep their opinions to themselves. Lyudmila arrived at the White House in late 1942. She was the first Soviet citizen to be a guest of the president. Franklin Roosevelt welcomed her. Eleanor Roosevelt took a liking to her. The First Lady saw the pain behind the sniper's eyes. She broke protocol and invited Lyudmila to tour the country with her. But the American press wasn't as welcoming as the First Lady. To the reporters, Lyudmila wasn't a soldier. She was a curiosity, a freak show. They had never seen a woman who killed men for a living. They didn't know how to process it. So they fell back on what they knew: sexism. The first press conference was a disaster. Lyudmila stood at the podium, standing at attention in her uniform. She looked out at a sea of male reporters in fedoras. She was ready to talk about the capabilities of the Mosin Nagant. She was ready to talk about the effective range of German machine guns. She was ready to talk about the piles of bodies in Sevastopol. The first question came from a reporter in the front row. "Miss Pavlichenko?" he asked, chewing on a cigar. "In your country, are women allowed to wear makeup on the front lines?" The translator whispered the question. Lyudmila frowned. "There is no rule against it," she said. "But who has time to think of her nose when a battle is going on?" The reporter scribbled furiously. Another hand went up. "Is it true you wear silk underwear under that uniform? Does the olive drab color make you feel fat? Do you curl your hair before you go into battle?" Lyudmila gripped the sides of the podium. Her knuckles turned white, the same hands that had squeezed the trigger on 309 Nazis. These men weren't asking about the war. They were mocking her, just like the recruitment sergeant in Odessa. They looked at her heavy black boots and laughed. One reporter wrote in his column the next day that she looked clumsy and fat in her uniform. He suggested she would be better off modeling nylon stockings than killing Germans. They treated her like a circus animal. Lyudmila stood there, taking the flashes of the cameras. She felt more exposed in the Willard Hotel ballroom than she ever had in no man's land. She looked at these soft men, with their soft hands and their clean suits. They had no idea what was happening in the East. They had no idea that while they asked about lipstick, German panzer divisions were burning villages to the ground. She realized that killing 309 men wasn't enough to earn their respect. She was going to have to shame them into it. The tour was heading to Chicago next. A massive rally, thousands of people. Lyudmila decided she was done answering questions about her fashion choices. She was going to give them a speech they would never forget. The train pulled into Chicago in late 1942. The rally was held in Grant Park. Thousands of people crammed into the space: union workers, mothers, businessmen, curious onlookers. They had come to see the Russian girl sniper. The newspapers had primed them. They expected a novelty act, a girl in a uniform who maybe got lucky a few times. Lyudmila Pavlichenko walked onto the stage. She wasn't wearing makeup. Her uniform was pressed but plain. The gold star on her chest caught the stage lights. The crowd murmured. They were looking at her heavy boots. They were looking at the lack of lipstick. Lyudmila stood at the podium. She looked out at the sea of American men, men of military age, men with strong backs and healthy lungs, men who were currently standing in a park in Illinois while her friends were eating boiled leather belts in Sevastopol. She remembered the questions from Washington, the silk underwear, the nail polish, the curling irons. She looked at her translator. She didn't need him to tell her what the crowd was thinking. She could read a room like she read the wind. She took a breath. She didn't smile. She leaned into the microphone and delivered the deadliest shot of her career. And she didn't even need a rifle. "Gentlemen," her voice rang out, translated over the loudspeakers. "I am 25 years old and I have killed 309 fascist invaders by now." The murmuring stopped. 309. The number hung in the air like smoke. She paused. She looked directly into the camera lenses that had been judging her appearance for weeks. "Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" Silence. Absolute vacuum-sealed silence. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The insult had landed. She had just called the entire male population of the United States cowards to their faces. Then, a roar. It started in the back and rolled forward like a shockwave. The crowd erupted. They weren't booing. They were cheering. They screamed. They threw their hats in the air. Because she was right. And they knew it. In that moment, Lyudmila Pavlichenko ceased to be a girl sniper. She became the conscience of the Allied war effort. The press tone changed overnight. The articles about her skirt length disappeared. The articles about her steely eyes and grim determination replaced them. American folk legend Woody Guthrie read about the speech. He picked up his guitar and wrote a song called Miss Pavlichenko. The whole world will love her for a long time to come, for more than 300 Nazis fell by her gun. But the workers of Chicago wanted to give her something more practical than a song. During a tour of the Colt factory, the union workers presented her with a gift. It wasn't a bouquet of flowers. It was a Colt 1911 semi-automatic pistol. Lyudmila took the weapon. She racked the slide. She checked the action. Solid steel, 45 ACP caliber, 7 rounds in the magazine. The stopping power of the 45 was legendary. It was slow, heavy, and brutal. Unlike the high-velocity snap of her Mosin Nagant, the Colt was a sledgehammer. Lyudmila smiled, a real smile. This was jewelry she understood. She gripped the pistol. It felt like American industry. It felt like the second front she had been begging for. Later, in Toronto, the Canadians gave her a Winchester Model 70 with a Weaver scope, the exact kind of rifle John George would carry in Guadalcanal a year later. She held the Winchester. She admired the bolt action, the smooth trigger pull, the superior optics. She told the crowd, "It is a beautiful gun. But in my country, we do not have such beautiful guns. We have only anger." The tour continued, but the dynamic had shifted. Lyudmila wasn't a diplomat asking for favors anymore. She was a warrior demanding action. She returned to the White House before leaving for Russia. Eleanor Roosevelt was waiting for her. The First Lady and the sniper sat in the private quarters. 2 women from different universes, one born to American aristocracy, the other forged in Soviet mud. But they understood each other. Eleanor promised Lyudmila that she would push the president for the second front. She promised that the American factories would keep churning out the steel needed to kill the fascists. Lyudmila believed her. As she boarded the plane back to the Soviet Union, Lyudmila looked at the Colt 1911 in her luggage. She was going home. But she wasn't going back to the front. The Soviet High Command had seen the newspaper clippings. They saw the crowds in Chicago. They realized that Lyudmila Pavlichenko was too valuable to risk in a limestone trench in Sevastopol. A dead sniper is a tragedy. A dead legend is a disaster. They were going to ground her. Lyudmila didn't know it yet. She thought she was going back to her unit. She thought she was going back to the hunt. She was about to face the one thing a sniper fears more than an enemy bullet: retirement. Lyudmila Pavlichenko returned to the Soviet Union expecting a rifle. She got a podium. She landed in Moscow in late 1942, ready to return to the limestone hell of the front lines. She checked her kit. She cleaned the Colt 1911 the American workers had given her, but the orders were waiting on the desk of the high command. "Major Pavlichenko," the general said, "you have done enough." She was promoted to major. She was given the Gold Star. She was given extra rations and a warm apartment. But she was stripped of the one thing that defined her: the permission to hunt. The logic was cold and mathematical. The Red Army had millions of infantrymen. They only had one Lady Death. If she went back to the front and caught a stray mortar round, the German propaganda machine would have a field day. The witch is dead. The Soviet Union is broken. She was too valuable to be risked. She was a national monument now. And monuments don't sit in foxholes, Lyudmila argued. She pleaded. She told them her eye was still sharp. She told them she could still hold a 2-inch group at 400 meters. They refused. Instead, they gave her a new assignment. If she couldn't kill Nazis herself, she would create a factory that did. She was assigned to the Vystrel Field Courses, the Central Women's Sniper Training School. Her job was to take 2,000 teenage girls, factory workers, students, farmers, and turn them into what she had become: invisible killers. Lyudmila didn't treat it like a classroom. She treated it like a filtration system. She was harder on those girls than the Germans ever would be. The training day started at 5 a.m. 10-mile runs with full kit. Then came the stalk. Lyudmila would stand in a field with binoculars. She would tell the students to crawl 500 meters toward her. If she saw the grass move, the student failed. If she saw a glint of sunlight off a scope lens, the student failed. If she heard a twig snap, the student failed. She taught them that shooting was the easy part. Any idiot can pull a trigger. To shoot, she told them, is 10% of the job. To hide is 90%. She taught them the ghillie craft she had learned in Sevastopol, how to weave local vegetation into their burlap suits so they looked like a bush, not a soldier in a bush suit. She taught them how to urinate without moving, how to slow their heart rate before a shot, how to wrap their rifles in rags to dampen the metallic sound of the bolt working. She taught them the ballistics of the Mosin Nagant 9130. The 7.62 by 54 millimeter R round drops 14 inches at 300 meters. At 600 meters, it drops over 100 inches. You don't guess the drop. You know the drop. You feel the drop. She drilled them on wind reading. A 10 miles per hour crosswind pushes the bullet 7 inches at 300 meters. That's the difference between a hit in the heart and a miss. Lyudmila was relentless. Some of the girls cried, some of them quit, but the ones who stayed, they changed. They stopped caring about their hair. They stopped giggling. Their hands got rough. Their eyes got flat. Lyudmila watched them transform. She saw the same look in their eyes that she had seen in the mirror after Leon had died. It terrified her. She wasn't just training soldiers. She was manufacturing widows. She was manufacturing ghosts. In 1943, her first class graduated. She stood on the parade deck as the girls marched past. They were carrying fresh rifles with PU scopes. They looked sharp. They looked ready. Lyudmila knew where they were going. Kursk, the Dnieper, the road to Berlin. She knew the statistics. The life expectancy of a sniper on the Eastern Front was measured in weeks. She wanted to grab a rifle and go with them. She wanted to be the one taking the shot, taking the risk. But she stood on the reviewing stand, trapped in her major's uniform, trapped in her fame. She watched the train pull away, carrying her students to the slaughter. She went back to her quarters. She opened the case of the Winchester Model 70 the Canadians had given her. She worked the bolt, click-clack. It was a beautiful machine, precision engineering, smooth walnut stock, but it was clean. There was no mud in the action, no scratches on the barrel. It felt like a toy. Lyudmila put the rifle away. She poured a drink. The war ground on for 2 more years. The Red Army pushed west. The students Lyudmila trained sent letters back. Major, I got 5 today. Major, I got a tank commander. Major, Katya is dead. The letters piled up. The kill counts rose. The names on the roster turned into names on grave markers. By 1945, the women trained at the Central School had over 12,000 confirmed kills. 12,000 Nazis who didn't go home. Lyudmila Pavlichenko had pulled the trigger 309 times, but the machine she built had pulled it thousands of times more. She had multiplied herself. When the news of the victory came in May 1945, Lyudmila didn't cheer. She didn't join the parades in Red Square. She sat in her office, surrounded by training manuals and ballistics charts. The war was over. The silence she had been hunting for 4 years had finally arrived. But silence is loud when you're the only one left to hear it. She was 29 years old. She was a major. She was a hero. And she was completely alone. The world wanted to know what Lady Death would do now that there was no one left to kill. The war ended, but the silence didn't. Lyudmila Pavlichenko hung up her uniform in 1953. She retired with the rank of major. She had the Gold Star. She had 2 orders of Lenin. She returned to Kiev University to finish the degree she had started in 1941. The professors looked at her differently now. When she raised her hand in a lecture hall, she wasn't just a student. She was the woman who had liquidated a battalion of men. She became a historian. It was a fitting choice. She had spent 4 years making history. Now she would spend the rest of her life recording it. But the transition wasn't smooth. You don't go from hunting men in limestone cliffs to grading papers without ghosts following you home. Lyudmila drank. She smoked chain cigarettes. Her health, shattered by the shrapnel in Sevastopol and the stress of the tour, began to fail. The Soviet Union treated her like a museum piece. They brought her out for parades. They put her on stamps. But they didn't know what to do with her sadness. Then, in 1957, the Cold War was freezing the world. The Iron Curtain was down. The Americans were the enemy again. But one American didn't care about politics. Eleanor Roosevelt came to Moscow. The former First Lady was touring the Soviet Union. The KGB handlers tried to steer her toward the factories and the monuments. Eleanor refused. She said she wanted to see her friend. She went to Lyudmila's small 2-room apartment. The KGB agent stood outside the door, nervous. They didn't know what secrets the 2 women would share. Inside, there were no secrets. Just 2 old friends. Lyudmila, the sniper who terrified the Wehrmacht, broke down. She hugged the American aristocrat and wept. For a few hours, the Cold War didn't exist. There was just a woman who had seen too much death, and the only person who had ever looked at her and seen the human, not the killer. It was the last time they would see each other. Lyudmila Pavlichenko died on October 10th, 1974. She was only 58 years old. The official cause was a stroke, but the real cause was the war. It had taken Leonid. It had taken her youth. And eventually, it took her life. She was buried in the Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow. Her rifle, the Mosin Nagant 1891/30 with the 3.5 times PU scope, sits in the Central Armed Forces Museum in Moscow. It sits behind glass, just like John George's Winchester sits in Virginia. Most people walk past it. They see a clunky wooden rifle. They see a piece of mass-produced Soviet iron. But if you look closely, you can see the wear on the bolt handle. You can see the scratches on the stock from the limestone of Sevastopol. It is the rifle that proved a history student with a manicure could outshoot the best professionals the German Empire could produce. It is the rifle that forced the world to stop laughing at women in uniform. When that recruiter in Odessa told her to go be a nurse, he thought he was dismissing her. He thought she was too fragile for the infantry. He was wrong. Lyudmila Pavlichenko wasn't fragile. She was the hammer that broke the myth of Nazi superiority. 309 confirmed kills, 36 enemy snipers, 1 Gold Star. She didn't just survive the war, she defined it. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that these stories matter, and check your subscription status. We are rescuing forgotten stories from the archives every single week. Stories about warriors who were underestimated, mocked, and then proved everyone wrong. Drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if you've ever heard of Lady Death before today. Are you watching from the US, the UK, from Kiev? We want to know who is keeping these memories alive. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering Lyudmila Pavlichenko. And remember, the next time someone tells you that you aren't built for the job, just think of the girl with the silk dress and the Mosin Nagant. We'll see you in the next one.